So pleased to be here virtually. I lead the governance program at the World Bank and Development Impact Evaluation Group, and I've been working with the Ministry of Finance for over 2 years now, all about assessing how the dashboard has impacted on policy and citizen engagement. And I was on my way to you excitedly to join in person and stopped in Vienna, where I had some other business and felt a bit funny, did a COVID test, and now I'm stuck in this nice but very far from Estonia hotel room where I'll have to stay for a few days because I got a positive test. So I'm very sorry that I'm not with you. I'm very pleased to have heard the first presentation, and some of my colleagues are in the room. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing together, which is under a way of working with governments that we call bureaucracy labs. I co-lead the bureaucracy lab at the World Bank with the idea that we can take a scientific approach in terms of detailed measurement and experimental methods to understand the impacts of policies like the dashboard that are embedded in public administration. And today's agenda is around the evidence that we've been collecting with the Ministry of Finance on the impacts of the dashboard. It's kind of like a stock take of the evidence we have so far. And we're really going to have an emphasis in this presentation on potential ways in which the dashboard could evolve in years to come. And so the intention here is to think a little bit about how the dashboard's played a role over the last 2 years. So I have been an avid fan of all things Estonia over the last few years and learned a lot from this evaluation. When I was in Järvavald last 2.5 years ago, I was given this wonderful bag, which I've been using at the World Bank, and so maybe advertising Järvavald a little bit to my colleagues, but more generally, I've been providing a window into the excellent work that you've all been doing to my colleagues at the bank and our clients around the world. And just a reminder that, of course, the World Bank works globally across Europe and around the rest of the world. And in many ways, the dashboard that you're putting in is both something that's been done many times, but also very new and innovative. And I'll try to start by describing what I mean by that. So let's just take a moment and reflect on what it is that we've tried to do together. And the Ministry of Finance's intention was to release data in a coherent way across sectors and across local governments that would make very clear two margins. Firstly, that how local governments are doing by sector relative to objective benchmarks that their scientific committee has agreed are kind of standard levels that should be expected. And then also to give some relative understanding of where different local governments are on different features. And so how would we conceive that this would change policy or change outcomes in Estonia? We always conceived of it something like this. There are two routes. The first is that exposure to the dashboard would change government directly. It would change public officials' own understanding about their performance. And it seems from the last presentation that this has definitely been true in some spheres and some sectors of particular interest and relevance to particular local governments. And therefore, it's been able to shift their priorities to try and invest in certain areas in different ways. That's one route. The other route, of course, is through citizens. By making this public and engaging a dashboard, the hope is that citizen beliefs would also change about how their local government was performing on different margins. This would increase engagement with local officials and then shift policy priorities through that more indirect but important route. So the question we have is, what's been happening on both of these routes over the last few years? So though I won't go through the details of measurement right now, and I'll do that as we go through, we wanted to try and collect some data on the extent to which the dashboard actually had the impact that it wanted in terms of engagement, and then also in terms of policy impact. And so I'm going to try and sketch out some of the measures that we've found through those. But before I do that, given the position of the World Bank, I thought I'd do a little bit of lessons from international experience. And this is based on international experience more generally, and also the experience that my department has had working with dashboards like these across the world. And I think I can summarize those lessons in 3 buckets. And the first is a little cautionary. It's a cautionary note. It says that many dashboards have been created in the world, and some have real impact, but others don't. They simply become artifacts. And I think this comes down to the following idea, is that much of what drives organizational performance is not electronic. It's tacit. It's the conversations people have and their experience of the policy world. It's committees who are operating on the information that they have absorbed to try and make the best decisions given their priorities. And so the question for those who are designing dashboards like these is always, how do we find a way into that conversation, into the policy conversation at the local government level? Could be amongst members, the mayor and his committee, or it could be amongst citizens and politicians. And I think for the public officials, there are 3 big pieces of this. And the first is just making interpretation of the dashboard for specific management decisions easy. Secondly is having a community of practice that bridges the dashboard and those decision points. And then finally, generating what we call an ecosystem for results. That could be individuals inside each of the local governments who are champions for what the dashboard can do for that local government. And then on the citizen side, we've found that it's always really about creating captivating lenses into the data that get citizens excited and talking. And so what would be a long-term plan as dashboards evolve and become either defunct or part of the national conversation? Well, one is to build a community of practice, and the fact that there are so many people online is a good start. It's building that community of practice over time so that there are lots of people who are continuously coming back to the dashboard as a piece of how they work. Then there's defining clear objectives at the center for impact. What is it that we're trying to impact? Monitoring those using clever measurements. So if it's, for example, the relationship between citizens and the public officials on the ground, well, what information do we have about what the conversations look like? And can we make sure that we're continuously innovating towards achieving those impacts as shown by the monitoring data? But then I also fear that sometimes the attention, once the dashboard's been launched and had a few years, it forgets that we're always looking for bridges into local government practice. And of course, local governments are the best way to help us build those bridges. And so a very quick summary of some of the examples of international practice that really combine those lessons is that here's an overview of some of the dashboards that we've worked with and studied. And we see that actually many countries don't exploit all the opportunities for dissemination of their data and the impact from the data that they collect. And so the green is where the things we think could be done are being done, and the purple where they're not. What we find is that dashboards with differentiated user access, so you give people a little bit of a specialized view into the dashboard, maybe the public or local government mayors or staff, something that's really what they want from the dashboard very immediately, that allows much more low-cost use and realization of what the dashboard can be used for each individual who's using it. Here's an example from the UK. This is the LG Inform website, which does a similar thing to the Minuomavalitsus dashboard, where they give specialized, customized dashboards and additional features to local authority users, as can be seen in the orange window. Similarly, the dashboards can start to understand the situation of specific groups of local government citizens or employees or any target group. And so finding a way to support the specialization of the dashboard to particular groups of interest has been a long-term strategy for success. Here again is the themed report section of the LG Inform website. An increasingly important element that we find for dashboards is to provide recommendations or action plan templates that support managerial actions in response to the results. Here's an example from Australia. And then monitoring those, if possible, even within the dashboard, which in some sense incentivizes improvements, both just by making them more salient, but also by making them something that can be tracked either at the centre or more broadly. And then on the citizen side, one of those lenses I was talking about, an example here from the United States federal government, is a wrapping up of all the indicators that are relevant to here, a great place to work, into an index so that citizens can understand the overarching messages of the dashboard. And so here's some areas to think about as we go forward. In international practice, sometimes it's hard to get citizens engaged unless that creativity comes for how to engage them with the dashboard. And then similarly, on the public official side, how do we support the bridging between the practice that we're asking to be changed and the information in the dashboard? So now let's localize and really try to understand what data says was the setting that the dashboard was created in Estonia. What I'm going to show is some data that we and the Ministry of Finance have collected that gives an understanding of what the public service context was in which the dashboard was implemented. From a survey of citizens we did across the country, we see that there's quite a degree of variation across Estonia in the satisfaction people have as their local government as a place to live. And we've actually measured this in multiple ways, and it really does seem that there's something robust about levels of satisfaction that you see here. And you'll be able to spot your local government. But what's important is to note that this varies a lot. The question is why? Well, the dashboard has articulated that service delivery levels vary. And here we take the data directly from the dashboard and we say, to what extent across sectors do local governments achieve the service levels that have been articulated? Well, what we see is, again, there's a huge variation in the extent to which individual local governments do actually achieve those service targets. Another critical question is, how do they relate? Well, we find that the service quality score across regions is a very good indicator of how satisfied individual citizens are with their local government as a place to live. Now, of course, what we're interested in is here, we know what extent the dashboard's picking up something that's relevant and useful. And it really does seem that the dashboard's saying something meaningful about what citizens care about. Well, we can ask them directly. And we did. We asked a representative sample of local citizens, but we also asked specifically students, because they are the future, the extent to which they really had interest in particular aspects of the dashboard. And in general, both across the population as large and the students, education, both preschool and basic, culture, sport, child protection and public health all came very, very high. And so people really seem to have a care about the level of service that they require, that they receive, but also they seem to care very specifically about those aspects of public services provided at the local government level. So let me just go back to that production function that I showed, showing these two routes between changing government directly, but also changing government in terms of influencing citizen participation. Well, so what do we know about citizen participation? Here we did a survey of citizens that also asked, how often do you contact city employees, officials, or departments? This varies, but what's fascinating about the Estonian context is that it's actually very high by international levels. That's true both in terms of contact, but also when we asked how many councillors of your local government can you name out loud, actually remarkably high by international standards as well. And so what's fantastic about this setting is people seem to have a real engagement with their local governments relative to other countries in the world, which means that both that top direct level influence in the production function, but also that lower level influence are potential routes to the dashboard having impacts. Now, I mentioned that one way to understand the extent to which the conversations of this much more vibrant citizen and local government official conversation is to look at the meetings that they have at the local government level. So what we did is that we took all of the minutes of local government meetings, these have all been published, from the last 5 years, and we, up until spring of this year, by the way, and we looked at the topics that are brought up at those meetings. And so, in some sense, the dominant area of conversation at the local level between citizens and public officials, as may not be a surprise to many of you, is in the areas of housing and heating and governance. This is very understandable. These are some of the key issues around land and around renovating homes and so forth. But in some sense, for the dashboard, the problem is that citizen interactions with public policy are really very pragmatic and very practical. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do you stimulate discussion on other topics? So, as I mentioned before, on education, on culture, on water, because they're starting from a low base of the conversations that are currently being had, as evidenced by the minutes of the last 5 years of meetings for the local government. And so the question is, what's happened with the dashboard? Did the dashboard engender and excite people to start engaging on other topics? So what we did is we took all of the times that anyone ever went into the dashboard and took their IP address, which locates the individual the individual citizen to a place in Estonia, but it also tells us how many unique visitors we've had at the dashboard. So at launch, there was a big spike, and 561 unique IP addresses per week were looking at the dashboard. Unfortunately, after a couple of weeks after the launch, this fell substantially to about 26 views per week. Now, this is very standard and is exactly what I was saying in my international experience review, is that a dashboard is frequently very exciting at the moment of launch, but then over time, and in some sense very rapidly, it becomes an artifact. However, we worked with the ministry and tried to advertise the dashboard and what it could provide individual citizens in terms of information about their local government through social media, different types of advertising. And what we saw was that significantly pushed up interest in the dashboard again. So there's a sort of underlying interest by public all across Estonia who want to know this information, but it has to be made interesting, engaging, and they have to be given that lens towards it. It needs to be sort of nudged to the top of their agenda. Now, what about public officials? Well, we've done some surveys of public officials in recent weeks, and we're going to continue doing that over the coming months. And our early pilots imply some very encouraging numbers. 76% of the people that we spoke to state that they have used the Minuomavalitsus dashboard to obtain information on their performance this year. And 37% state that they use it multiple times a month. So for some people, the dashboard has become a tool for managing their public service, as was evidenced in the talk we had just before this one. And in qualitative discussions, some very much led by Rivo, who will speak in a few minutes, officials really argued that if there's a clear bridge between the dashboard and management decisions, capitalizing on really the results from the dashboard, then it becomes a very useful tool. So in terms of engagement, let me just show a picture. We saw a huge impact at launch, and this was, I think, true for both public officials and citizens. There was then a fall in how much engagement there was. And then we started to use social media to try and bump it up a little bit. And we saw that people were responsive to that. But overall, there's a lot of latent interest in the raw product that is the dashboard. Now, there is some geographic variation in the interest. The red are nothing too special. The red just shows you which local governments we tried to stimulate the Facebook advertising, the social media advertising. But what you see is that there's a little bit of variation in the local governments in terms of how much engagement we've seen from the dashboard, but it's relatively even. And again, compared with the international benchmarks, it really is very even. So there's demand everywhere. As I said, this 37% using it multiple times a month or multiple times a year are the dominant of public officials. This is a very good story from the World Bank evaluation team's perspective. The dashboard isn't just being used, but there's the potential for it to be used even more. So to what extent have we already seen changes in policy making? So we asked this group of pilot interviewees, to what extent do you find the Minuomavalitsus dashboard useful for your job? Well, a third said, well, very useful. 44% slightly useful. So they're potentially a bucket of people who we could engage with more. And then there's this tail who haven't found it useful at all, which may very well be understandable. But it's the majority who are saying, yes, this has really changed and been useful for practice on the ground. Now, here's the first real test of whether it's having impacts. What you see here are changes in service quality before the dashboard was produced and afterwards. The orange dots are the 2018 to 19 changes. And what they show is how much did the poorest performing areas, service areas, change between those 2 years. And as you can see, they jump around, but it's very close to zero. And then you've got the blue dots, which is after the dashboard has been implemented. And what you see is that those areas that were highlighted as having a bad performing or some of the worst performing service areas in the local government, once the dashboard's in place, they jump in score, and they do so in many local governments quite substantially. Now, we're going to be doing lots of research over the coming year, continuing to monitor the extent to which the dashboard has really had impact. But this is probably the best piece of evidence so far to show that there is an impact of the local government when you look across time in how it's influencing local government practice. So 3 cheers for this piece of evidence and for the work of the dashboard. Interestingly, though, it does not seem to be affecting budgets in the way we thought it might. When we asked members of the public service, to what extent do you think that the dashboard is affecting budgetary decisions in the sector of your municipality? As you can see, it's a relatively uniform disagreement. And when we look at the budget data, we can focus in on particular areas, for example, social protection, and look at the extent to which the ranking of social protection in how well or poorly the local government is performing, whether it predicts budget, and we see it does not. So at the moment, something is being changed at the local government level that's affecting service delivery outcomes, but it's not at the moment seemingly affecting budget in a systematic way across the country. So now, do we see changes in the relationship between citizens and officials, which is that second loop that I've been talking about? So we asked public officials in this pilot, what proportion of your discussions with citizens mention the Minuomavalitsus dashboard? Many say none, and quite a large number say between 1 and 20%. Now, you will have to interpret whether for you that is success or not. For me, that is mild success. The fact that it's even started to be part of the conversation is exciting. Now, when we scraped all of those minutes, we don't really find reference to it in the minutes yet. But the fact that it's starting to enter conversations is exciting. To what extent, we then ask them, do you think that the dashboard has improved the flow of information between municipalities and citizens? And here, there's agreement by about 40% of individuals. Again, it's not saying that we've had success maybe in the way we want it, but it's certainly starting to tell us that something could happen. And if we can strengthen this area, then it really could be a fantastic platform for an improved conversation between citizens and local governments. Okay, so then I'm going to wrap up. I hope that I've shown you some very positive things about the local, the dashboard, but also that there are areas for growth. And often this moment in a dashboard's life cycle is a really critical one. As I said, we've seen from international best practice that where we take the dashboard now is going to completely transform whether it becomes a thriving element of Estonia's political, social and economic geography, or whether it slowly becomes less used. Here are some of my thoughts on the road ahead and the choices for Ministry of Finance, but I should have said here for all of us. The core lessons from the evaluation that we're undertaking are as follows. Minuomavalitsus has brought together data on service delivery in Estonia in a way that's never been done before, and a range of public officials that this has been useful along multiple margins. And we do seem to see that it's having effects on the conversation with citizens and on real outcomes. But many dashboards simply wither and die if they're not curated, interpreted, and evolving. So let's refine the community of practice that we already have, strengthen the production of tailored reports, and you will be best placed to tell us what you want. Learn from the set of local governments that responded strongly, as we're doing today, and ask, what's the lens that's going to really capture the interest of citizens and other non-government actors? Because that's an area that, as we've seen, could be strengthened further. And then let's continue to measure success. Let's integrate an evaluation toolkit into ongoing assessment. Let's make sure we keep having these check-ins. And let's have a reflection and evolution point every so often. On engagement with public officials, well, the cyclical performance reports are very large. They highlight key conclusions and areas for improvement. But let's try and create automatic shorts that make the numbers more accessible to local government officials, that just make it really easy to really understand what the dashboard is saying for my work. I'm a public official in many ways. I have many dashboards thrown at me. What I want to know from each is what's the piece of information that's most important for me to understand for my work today. These regular workshops that this is part of ensure ongoing conversations, and I wholeheartedly support their happening. The question is whether they're enough, or do we need to keep having separate consultations at the local government level? And I thank Rivo and Mikkel and others who've taken those forward, and you'll hear from Rivo about them today. What about engagement with citizens? Let's continue to promote the dashboard amongst citizens. In some sense, citizens have so much to think about. How do we create a high degree of interest and excitement given the high levels of digital literacy that we have? It's a very broad dashboard. And so we can think of a whole range of visual promotional materials, taking maybe every year a particular topic or an index that excites public in a way that the dashboard currently doesn't. But then let's engage citizens in discussions and reforms so that they see the practical dividends. Let's get some success stories of what's happened on the dashboard so far and really emphasize them. Finally, I have to say it, I'm an evaluator on measurement. Let's continue expanding the dashboard scope. I really was pleased to see the evolution in the 2022 version, really expanding to new indicators. But what is the next big shock that the dashboard could be flexible to respond to? What is the next thing that's going to happen that we need the dashboard to help us make management decisions on, and that will be critically useful to a public official having to make a decision based on the dashboard in response to that shock? But then also keep up the monitoring of the online dashboard traffic, where it's coming from, who it is. We can help understand meeting minutes and what they determine at the local level, and of course continue the conversation with local government colleagues. Thank you all so much. I am so sorry I can't be with you. As you can hear, my voice is now getting a little croaky, but I have been so excited to work on this project over the last 2 years, and I can't tell you how much promise I think it holds. And I hope that we continue the discussion today to strengthen it into the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel, Roger, for your presentation. I wish you a swift recovery, but I hope you have the energy maybe to take a couple of questions. So, dear audience, do you have any questions? Ma võin siin olla ka see nii-öelda tõlkiv lüli. Võite küsida inglise keeles, võite küsida eesti keeles, võin tõlkida vahele. Aga mõtteid, küsimusi, mida tegelikult ettekanne tekitas. Jaa, Rivo.
Hello, Daniel. Rivo is here. It's very nice to see and very nice presentation. Thank you very much. I have one question. You showed very perfectly the connection between the municipality level and the citizens. Do you measure the connection between municipality officials and state officials? I mean the ministry, how influence this dashboard influence to the ministry side as a state policy provider?
This is a wonderful question. We are aiming to survey some state officials to try and get a feeling of this. So this is something that we're very keen to understand better. And so in the next few months, as we do those surveys, we will provide updates to you and to anyone in the community who's interested. It's harder, of course, because we have a small number, and finding just the right person who's been influenced in those large ministries is hard. But I think qualitative work here would also be useful. And so I think as we move forward, I think thinking about how to get good case studies of success at the state level is also very welcome.
Thank you, Daniel, for the answer. Do we have any other questions or just thoughts that you want to share? Kas on ehk veel mõtteid või küsimusi, mida tahate jagada? Daniel, then I will be asking one question. One of the suggestions that you brought was that we need to find this sort of lens that would be the sort of captivator or be the engagement sort of, I don't know, facilitator or whatever. Do you have any good international examples of where you showed some of the dashboards, but where it actually worked in a sense that it was able to produce this sort of engagement with the local municipality citizens? So what has been the sort of interesting lens that has been able to sort of facilitate and create that connection with citizens and with citizen engagement?
Let me continue on the two examples that I started with, which was I'll give one at the federal government level and then one at the local government level. So the federal government is the use of the federal government employee viewpoint survey to create a Great Places to Work in Government index. And this was even mentioned in the House of Representatives as an influencer in how people are deciding whether they work for different entities within the US government. And so just by packaging a set of survey results in an interesting way, and these come from the FEV's dashboard, they were really able to change the way that citizens perceive the quality of working for different institutions. So that was the federal government example. At the local government example, the LG Inform, they've taken thematic issues. So for example, during COVID, they put out data on the readiness of local governments along different margins for the pandemic, but also their responses. And this got a huge amount of media engagement and mediated the extent to which citizens would go and access services because they were advertised on this, but also engage citizens in where they felt their local governments weren't doing enough. And so this was a shock that the dashboard was able to respond to and then really mediate citizens' information and action regarding something which obviously was very important. So those are two examples. I can provide more background to those if people want, but thank you for the great question.
Thank you. I think the second the second example is especially interesting for me personally as well, is I think using up-to-date data and making it accessible for public and creating a discussion about it. I think that's a very that's the way we can actually go forward in Estonia as well. Thank you again, Daniel, Roger, for a very thorough and very good presentation.